we're working on the parami, with the parami of Metta. So I'd like to share with you a description of what I think is a perfectly ordinary moment or series of moments. So my routine this morning begins with getting up pretty early after 2 days of celebrating the Jewish high holy holidays, pretty physically taxing, leading services in my synagogue. Pretty tired. I could use a break. No break here for today. And taking my son to school. He's the only kid in my neighborhood who goes to this school. In good circumstances, it's a 35-minute drive each way under good circumstances. But today it was raining quite heavily. And I'm not sure if it's this particular time of year or there's construction somewhere, but the roads in general are more congested anyway. And with today's weather, it was made even worse. And I don't know how many of you can relate to this, but I suspect a whole good many of you watching Waze or whatever other GPS on your screen, the time just climbing, the estimated time of arriving, just growing longer and longer. You keep on clicking alternate routes to see maybe, you're going to squeeze some wisdom out of this computer. There's no wisdom to be had. There's no bypassing this reality, one way or another. This day and this schedule is not working the way I ideally wish it to go. And then my son turns to me and asks how much longer I really need to go to the bathroom. Now, I've already had to stop somewhere on the highway and make an emergency stop for him. This has happened before. I couldn't afford for this to happen today. And then he reminded me, I probably could use the bathroom pretty badly too, actually, now that I stop and think about this. So then I turn on my favorite podcast to try to make the time go by a bit more pleasantly, but no new episode has been dropped yet. And then I say, well, okay, let's turn on my favorite Dharma app and listen to a Dharma talk. And the app is frozen. It just won't go. It's not working out today. And eventually I drop my son off to school, and eventually I make it back. A bit late to my first meeting, to my first session, which I had to begin on the phone. And this is perfectly ordinary. If this hasn't happened exactly this way for all of you, something very similar has happened. Yeah. So when we work with Metta, or when we work with any of the paramis, when we work with any of the Brahma Viharas, we are inevitably working with ourselves and with the hindrances that arise. So this morning's companion was aversion. That was my morning companion for my commute. In the Buddha's words, and this is obviously a translation, and I'll say why I say that in a moment. Hatred can never cease by hatred. Hatred can only cease by love. This is an eternal law. A hatred's a pretty strong word. I felt hatred, but in the ordinary moments of life, like the ones I just described, hatred isn't quite cutting it. It's not quite hatred, but it certainly is aversion. Maybe a nice sprinkling of ill will along with aversion. But when Buddha talks about hatred, he's talking about all of this. He's talking about anger and fear and guilt and impatience and grief and disappointment and frustration and dejection and anxiousness, despair, all of this. And aversion and anger are known as the far enemies of metta. They're essentially the opposite of the state of love that metta is. When Buddha describes aversion, he says the state of aversion is a state that has great consequence, but is easily overcome. Well, it has great consequence. I think that part is pretty easy to understand. The reactivity that we can be vulnerable to going into, whether it's with our actions or with our words, as a result of the feelings that we're having and being in a state of reactivity around them. Most certainly, experiences of aversion and anger have great consequence. But they can also be easily overcome. That's interesting. I think that the reason they can be easily overcome, perhaps more easily than other states that we talk about, is because it is so easily and readily recognizable. It is so tangible. It's smacking us in the face if we're just willing to acknowledge it. Our frustration, our ill will, our anger, and the reactivity that we're having. It's so obvious. Teacher Sharon Salzberg talks about two potential ways that we can experience anger and aversion. One is in an outward direction, like the fingers are pointed outward. This is where we experience anger and rage at someone, at something, towards someone. There's a lot of energy, and it's very expressive. And then we can experience aversion where it's sort of going in the opposite direction. It's going in towards us. It's like a held in kind of a way that we're experiencing aversion. The energy around this aversion is like frozenness and paralyzing. And whether the object of that aversion is ourselves or another, we are containing that experience of aversion within ourselves, within our minds. We're not expressing it towards ourselves. We're not expressing it with ourselves or with another. And essentially, these are the same mind states, whether it's going outward or inward. It's the same mind states, just manifesting in a different way. And the mind in this moment becomes really narrow and constricted. It isolates on someone or on something, and it becomes fixated on it. We develop a tunnel vision in that moment. We don't see any way out. It becomes fixed. The experience is here, and it seems to be in the moment endless. Will never change. And through our metta practice and through our mindfulness practice, we can begin to see that there is an essential truth that is larger and more true than the subjective experience that we're having, which is that essentially everything rises and passes away. Sharon Salzberg compares the experience of aversion to a rainstorm, which is particularly apropos for my experience of aversion this morning. It arises and it passes away. It isn't really about I, me, you, or mine. In this recognition, in this clear seeing, we can look and truly see others and ourselves. This moment of seeing, this is where metta is born, right in that moment. It's interesting when we think about aversion and ill will. I think that in general, in society, we have difficulty with this. What's the difference between feeling anger, for example, and venting anger, right? People say, I'm just venting. What is venting about? Even in the professional world of psychology and psychotherapy, we've had difficulty with this. I remember earlier on in my career where there were protocols for treatment for people that were struggling with their anger, where the professional would encourage them, take a pillow and punch a pillow, let your anger out. And then subsequent research showed that this wasn't very, very helpful advice at all. When we act in our anger, we are reinforcing these anger states. And yet, the alternative of holding it in, of suppression, of repression is not helpful either. And this isn't what skillful practice is about. This isn't a practice meant for people that are anger aversive to find a way to bypass those experiences of anger, of rage, of aversion, in order to just be at peace at all times. I relate to that. I'm anger aversive. I have my own complicated history with people that had difficulty with anger. And I just don't want anything to do with ragefulness and extreme expressions of anger. And there is a part of me that's attracted to this practice, to these practices, in the hopes, in the fantasy that I will rise and be above these types of mind and mood and feeling states. And yet, when I am able to hold myself with honesty and clear seeing without judgment, ragefulness is not something I'm immune to. Feeling real primitive, really intense desires to lash out in some way at someone or something or for some reason. It's not pretty. It's not fun to acknowledge, but it's deeply human to have these experiences. Metta is the moment where we become willing to see it without judgment and to hold a space for the experience itself, creating a bit more spaciousness around the reactivity that we typically go to. That reactivity could be either the acting out of the feeling or the suppression and the holding in and the avoiding of the feeling, or a combination of both. Allowing the body to be soft and the breath to be available and to breathe with this difficult moment, to acknowledge the difficulty. Can we see in moments of anger and in moments of aversion the suffering that is actually happening? Can we see the moment as suffering, whether it's ours or another's? Suffering also feels a bit extreme, like that word hatred. Was I actually suffering this morning in the commute, in the experience? Yeah, in an ordinary way. These are perfect examples of ordinary suffering. Can we see it without comparing it, minimizing it? Well, that's not real suffering. I'm involved with a nonprofit that supports sexual abuse survivors in my community. And one of the most painful things for me to hear is when members share that they have such a hard time acknowledging their experiences and the consequences it had, because my story isn't like her story or his story. I didn't go through what she went through. The difficulty that sometimes we have in acknowledging our own experience just for what it is, without comparing and without judging. And that moment is metta, seeing ourselves with kindness, in truthfulness, and with eyes of understanding and care. So even as we practice today on the cushion, and certainly as we proceed with our day off the cushion, opening ourselves to seeing where are the moments of ordinary suffering, right? Hopefully they're ordinary. I wish for all of us to just have ordinary moments of suffering for today, nothing too extraordinary. But what are those moments like for us? The moments of aversion, the moments of resentfulness or ill will that creep up for perfectly understandable reasons. Can we see them for the moments of suffering that they truly are, albeit ordinary suffering? And this seeing is metta. Taking a moment after the seeing to acknowledge to ourselves, this is the practice of metta. This is the cultivation of the heart in how we relate with ourselves and with others. Piercing through the delusions and the hatred for clear seeing. Yeah, thank you. Okay. So let's take some time to check in with the body, see what's being asked for right now as we ready ourselves for a little bit of sitting. Gentle movement, gentle stretching, shaking it out. I really invite us today to play and to welcome any moment that we encounter, every moment that we encounter in our practice today, where we meet and experience a hindrance as an opportunity to see it as ordinary suffering, and then say to ourselves, and this is metta. Ding, gold star, metta moment. Allowing the body to settle. With no sense of rush or pressure. With eyes that are either open, gently open, or closed, whatever feels supportive. Perhaps considering beginning today with an intention for the practice, an aspiration or a resolution. I'd like to capture as many moments as possible in my practice that are available for me to notice of difficulty, of reactivity, of mind wandering, of difficult mind or heart states. Capture them with eyes of understanding. Recognizing that the first several minutes of formal practice really is an unfolding and a settling process. Often for me, it's like with a sense of arriving. Everything that I need to cultivate my metta is available right here in this moment. Whether it's moments of self referential thinking or feeling states that feel particularly real in the heart, in the body. Every single one of these are opportunities, the raw ingredients for seeing with eyes of understanding. It's very easy to take moments that feel challenging or uncomfortable and meet that aversion with aversion, to push away or to lean away, to turn away. Oftentimes in the sitting practice, aversion is hiding out, shows up after a time. Some thoughts that might be niggling or memories of past experiences, recent or in the long distant past, start showing themselves up. Instead of pushing them away and resisting, what's it like to say, I see you, I see you. Perhaps the sense of aversion or anger dissolves into something else.